Let's bring in our panel now. Jose Custodio is in Hong Kong. He's a military historian and senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Strategy and Development Studies. Stephen Cutler is in Manila. He's a security analyst and a former chief of FBI operations in the Philippines. And completing our panel also in Manila is Amina Rasul. She's the president of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Jose, let me start with you. 1 year on, when we look at Marawi, did the Philippine state win the war, but are they perhaps losing the peace?
I think that as of now, we can still say that the government still has the window of opportunity to do things right. Okay, so far the Maute has been having difficulty in trying to recruit. Okay, it's actually on the run because it exhausted itself in last year's battle. Okay, so there are remnants. Okay, but they cannot be discounted. Okay, because even though, as I said, that there is a window of opportunity for the government, there still remains. Okay, for them to do things right, but that will be steadily decreasing as time passes. Okay, so because there's already existing complaints already from residents in Marawi, and especially the displaced people. So that can eventually may cause some form of resistance against the government.
Stephen Cutler, what did we learn from those 5 months of fighting last year?
Well, one of the things that I think that we learned is that there are many, many facets to the problem in Marawi. There was drugs involved, there's corruption. There are all sorts of issues that really complicate the battle that we had over the last year. And I include the entire year because trying to resettle that many people and rebuild the manufacture of drugs, the corruption, and all the different facets, that's far beyond merely the army fighting. That said, the intelligence, understanding of the terrain, who they were actually fighting against, was sadly lacking. And I think that that's a serious issue that the government needs to deal with as well. You know, Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago told us, know your enemy, know yourself. And they seem to have missed knowing their enemy.
Stephen, what didn't they know about their enemy? Where did they get it wrong?
Well, I think one of the things that they didn't know was the ability of these people to move about in an urban environment and basically own what I call own the terrain. They didn't realize the extent that these people held actual ground within an urban environment. It's one thing to own some territory that you're not comfortable in operating in, such as jungles and mountains and so on, but in an urban terrain, you expect the government to actually know what's going on, have a good sense of what the people are doing and who's doing what with whom. And that seems to have been, again, I say seems to have been lacking.
Amina Rasul, when we look at the death toll, more than 1,000 killed, yes, a lot of Daesh and Maute militants or even suspected militants, a lot of civilians, 168 soldiers and policemen were killed. Extraordinary cost. When we look at some of these images as well of Marawi, it's horrendous. It's almost post-apocalyptic, right? When we see the results 1 year on, are you happy with the results? Are you happy that the place is now in a position to be rebuilt?
Well, we're not ecstatic. Nobody's happy, not even government, about the delay in the start of the rehabilitation of Marawi. But before I go on with that, let me just say something about the analysis of the fighting. what is true that everything was complicated by these interlocking issues of drug trade, which fed part of this extremist group, and the political uh, activities going on, corruption. But really, the siege of Marawi, many of us believe that it could have been avoided. And that one of the basic problems was maybe miscommunications within the top echelons of the national decision making process. We truly believe that if those who had the hand in developing the strategy were old hands in Mindanao, like Defense Secretary Lorenzana, then perhaps a different strategy would have emerged. Instead, you had this protracted urban warfare, which did not need to happen. Now, having said my piece about that, the rehabilitation of Marawi, it's been 1 year and 5 months since the start of the siege. It's been a year since the liberation of Marawi. There have been some major problems in the start of the rehab, one of which is the failure of the original consortium organized by some Chinese companies in getting the go signal to start with the rehabilitation project. So now they had to basically start from scratch.
Right.
What worries me is the situation within the camps. If you are talking about recruitment for extremist group, for ISIS, you target those who have been disenfranchised, you target those in the camps. And if I were to develop the strategy for Marawi, I would not wait for the reconstruction of the city. I would concentrate on the rehabilitation of the people who are in the camps. I have been to the camps many times. We are organizing projects there, and it is miserable.
Right.
If I were to recruit for ISIS, this is ready-made for me.
But it's interesting, right? Because then you have the Chinese, for example, who gave $60 million, the US giving, the US giving $60 million, the Chinese giving $20 million. It's far easier to rebuild a road than to rebuild hearts and minds, right? You're going to take that money and you're going to try and rebuild the city. So this is a tough ask and a tough challenge. Jose, you've been there recently, and we're going to look at some of your photographs that you took. Yes. Thankfully, thank you for giving us permission to run them. When I look at some of your pictures, and I look at some of the pictures from other people, Mother Jones and other agencies have been there, it looks very similar to Mosul after Daesh was kicked out of there and destroyed, that they lost their stranglehold of the place. Does the place look, seem, and feel uninhabitable, Jose? Is it a place where people cannot live at this moment in time?
For starters, okay, nobody can stay there for one simple reason. I don't think the military has cleared the area of unexploded ordnance, okay? There apparently are a lot of unexploded ordnance there because the place was heavily shelled and heavily bombed, okay? And several large 500-pound bombs still remain, I think, unrecovered. Okay, and we haven't even talked about the artillery shells that have been duds. Okay, that are still there, or the mortar rounds that have failed to explode. See, the thing is that when you talk about rehabilitation, okay, it's easy to rehabilitate a town that has been destroyed by a typhoon, right? But you can't rehabilitate, you can't build, even if the Chinese consortium was allowed to proceed with its programs, it cannot do anything unless the area is cleared of explosives, okay, or unexploded. And by that, on that very score alone, that area is cordoned off because of the fear of some undiscovered bombs or shells. Okay, so that thing alone could delay further any rehabilitation. Okay, so you already have problems in the rehabilitation of the city in terms of awarding bids, contracts. Then there's also the land issue problem there, that people who there's a fear that you can have land grabbing in that city. Okay, as developers come in and then redraw everything, and at the same, so with that problem, now you have this other problem of unexploded ordnance. So what are we going to do about that? Okay, so you can't have a rehabilitation going. I mean, you can't have reconstruction if you don't have those things.
Right.
So I'm not so sure if the government has already cleared that entire area. I doubt, actually.
Yeah. Stephen Cutler, let's
So
talk.
a lot needs to be done. So,
Certainly, Jose. Certainly,
so
Jose.
then we.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
And fair point. So, Stephen Cutler, let's talk about this kind of devil's cocktail of the local grievances, maybe that's the Maute element, mixed with a global caliphate agenda of ISIS or Daesh. Those two come together, it creates something ugly, and the government has to take it on. When you spoke earlier on about the government underestimating or misunderstanding who they were fighting, is there also an argument to be made that moving forward, they don't quite know how to fight this duality of both the sort of global ISIS element and the local grievances? How do you solve that? How do you tackle that?
Well, that's an incredibly difficult issue, and it's actually one of the things that as the United States and the EU move forward, I think there are many, many lessons that can be learned from the Philippine context, almost a living laboratory, if you will, for the future. Because one of the things that we've got to worry about is, in the old days, there was a hierarchical command structure, if you will. You had Osama bin Laden, who was in charge, who had to kind of sign off on some things and different projects going forward, funding going forward, and so on. In these days, though, ISIS can claim that they've got these groups in southern Philippines, northern Philippines, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. And those groups can claim to be part of global ISIS. And in fact, they've never really talked to each other. There is no funding going back and forth, or very little funding going back and forth that we can trace through the traditional, what we'll call counterterrorism financing investigations. And so it's really, really difficult to break these things up. It's going to take some very strong thinking on the part of intelligence community, whether that's law enforcement, military. I would also suggest the academic world in social media and psychology, criminology, and other such groups to really think about how we can use a whole of government approach to try to stop this.
Right.
It's going to take some research into what used to be called lone wolf, but now has gone into small groups, cells.
Right.
How do we break those up? How do we identify them? How do we find them? For example, the suicide bombing family in Indonesia a few weeks ago. Well, how do we identify those people? Oh my gosh.
Yep.
It's very, very difficult. How do we get into their psychology?
Certainly. Amina Rasul, Mindanao is still under martial law. Is it justified?
Well, things have improved in Marawi, certainly. So I think even the Marawi residents welcome martial law. But how long do you extend it? Is it going to have other ramifications, other impact, negative impact? What worries me about the situation in Marawi, all of this anxiety, all of this unhappiness is taking place as the government is preparing to assist in the plebiscite, creating a new region. Now, if you care to look at some data, I would point you to the Social Weather Station's SWS website. We did a survey of 3 conflict-affected areas last April. Marawi, Lanao del Sur, which is the province where Marawi is, and Maguindanao. And we asked questions of the respondents, trying to determine their appreciation of what government is doing. And let me tell you that the unhappiness level is rising. And this will have impact on the success of the plebiscite, especially in Marawi. In the plebiscite, what we want is for the present region of autonomy, the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, to expand, to include more areas what we don't want is for members of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao breaking away, saying no, they
Right.
don't want to be part of this new region because of the anxiety that's happening in Marawi.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And give me that website again, Amina, just for our viewers' sake.
It's the Social Weather Stations, SWS, the leading polling station
Okay.
of my country.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, for people who want to get a pulse of what people think in the region. Good to talk to all of you. It's been a pleasure. Amina Rasul, Stephen Cutler, and Jose Custodio. All the best. Hope to have you on the program again.